Hi everyone, welcome to the podcast Byzantium and Friends. I'm Anthony, your host. Like many civilizations, Byzantium has its share of famous women, great women, about whom one writes biographies or plays or even movies. However, in its great women, Byzantium has not been altogether fortunate, and this is largely for two reasons. One, because of the choices that have been made, and second, because of the way in which women in Byzantine civilization have been framed. And what I mean by that is a traditional model of sort of despotic Orientalism that actually comes from ancient Greece, like before anything like, Eastern Roman civilization existed. And the idea is that in a despotic monarchy, sort of real men, sort of freedom-loving men, are oppressed by a despotic state that's run by usually some sort of oppressive tyrant figure. And this dynamic gives the opportunity to sort of other kinds of people, especially women and eunuchs at the court, to exercise a kind of power that they wouldn't have in a society of free, equal men. And so these kinds of despotic Oriental monarchies tend to be characterized by these scheming, powerful, vindictive women and eunuchs who sort of arrange things behind the scenes. You find this kind of theory actually even in Aristotle, and it becomes characteristic of the way that Constantinople, the political culture there, were described in Western sources, with increasing emphasis on those aspects, into the 18th, 19th, 20th centuries. Now, coupled with that ideological framework are the problems caused by some of the choices that were made or had to be made or were kind of inevitable or unavoidable. So probably the most famous Byzantine woman ruler is Irene, who restored the veneration of icons in the late 8th century and ruled in her own name. She was the first person in Roman imperial history to do so, that is, not to be reigning in the name of a minor son, or only until she found a new husband or something like that. And Irene is almost like a candidate for sainthood because she restored the veneration of icons, the Council of Nicaea II. However, there is a huge sort of dark stain on her reputation, which is that she not only engaged in conflict with her son when he came of age, but eventually arrested and blinded him in order to rule on her own. So that doesn't work very well. Also, her reign, not very successful. She was deposed by a finance minister. All right. Second most famous case is Theodora, obviously. And here we have some very, very engaging and graphic descriptions of her background and personality by Procopius, rightly understood to be rhetorical hyperbole. Yet it's not clear what remains once you strip the hyperbole away. In other words, the interest in Theodora is almost entirely that hyperbole. So all of the endless novels that are written and biographies and so on, it's just engaging with that. And if you take that away, it's not that clear what's left. Obviously a very important person at Justinian's court, but so were many empresses. And also, it's not entirely clear that Procopius's picture is entirely made up. We have other contemporary sources written by people who should have been sympathetic to her, anti-Chalcedonian bishops like Severus of Antioch, who say pretty similar things about her. All right, number 3, Anna Komnene. Incredible author, historian, patron of philosophers, interested in philosophy in the 12th century, daughter of an emperor, major source for the reign of her father, Alexius Komnenos. She would actually work great as a kind of, banner figure, sort of famous woman from Byzantium. That hasn't happened because the whole framework of, evil women meddling in politics who shouldn't get involved in things that are, beyond their ken and all that has been applied to her. And instead of her being seen as a real pioneer in how she very carefully and, in my view, successfully walk this fine line between what's expected of a proper aristocratic woman at that time and the kind of more masculine traits that one has to engage in discussions of politics and warfare and so on. And she did that, and she should be given full credit for that. Instead, she's been cast as a sort of vindictive, angry person who plotted against her brother and all of this stuff, which it turns out probably is not even true. And for that, I recommend you to my colleague Leonora Neville's excellent book on Anna, who unravels how all of this just sheer gender discourse was applied to Anna. And if you strip that away and you see what she's actually doing in the book, it looks very, very different. But so she's a case where, there's this sort of question mark about her that is entirely of our own making, or actually even some people a bit later than her, like Nikitas Choniatis, sort of contributed a little bit to the making of this negative picture of Anna. And finally, we come to the person we'll be talking about in today's episode, and this is Hypatia of Alexandria, a pagan philosopher, brilliant thinker, very, very famous person, like a celebrity in her own time, who was brutally murdered by some para-ecclesiastical organizations working for Bishop Cyril of Alexandria. Hypatia has received, obviously, tons of attention throughout history, but especially in modern times, even as an icon for feminism. There was a film made about her called Agora, which my guest and I talk about at the end of this episode. At the University of Michigan, there's a building called the League, and it has a room with portraits of famous women in it, and she's one of them. Now, of course, you can probably easily guess what the, quote, problem with Hypatia is, even though in her own lifetime she seems to have been a mediating figure who was trying to, de-escalate conflicts. Because of the way she died, and because her death can be used to fuel a sort of pagan versus Christian narrative in the 5th century, and was for many people at the time, and modern historians generally want to avoid that. Also, let's not kid ourselves, a lot of scholarship on Byzantium is produced by people who are sort of very sympathetic to the Orthodox tradition and the theology, and Cyril of Alexandria was one of the most important theologians of his time then and later. And so highlighting Hypatia as like your banner sort of famous woman is problematic if you're coming from that point of view. So that's another reason why there's a question mark of controversy above her that had nothing to do with her. But there you have it. Hypatia is the topic of discussion with my guest today, who is Silvia Ronchey, professor of Byzantine Studies at Roma Tre University in Rome, Italy. She's a very prolific author, has written scholarship and also more popular books on all periods of Byzantine history from the beginning to the end, and often appears also in Italian media, talking about Byzantium and broader cultural issues as a public intellectual, and someone I've been wanting to meet for a very long time. She has also written a very successful book in Italian on Hypatia. It's been through a number of editions and was recently published in English translation. Now, I should warn you, it's not exactly an easy book to read. It doesn't proceed in like a linear biography. If you know nothing about Hypatia, you'll find that you're jumping between the sources and the modern reception, because the book is about all of the different images of Hypatia that have accumulated over the centuries that we have to kind of work through and past in order to get to the true story, which is the subtitle of the book. A couple notes before we get started. There are a couple places where Silvia says integral, by which she means what in American English we would call extremist or fundamentalist. Second, again, thanks to medievalist.net for reposting these episodes. So let's get right to it. Here's my conversation with Silvia. Silvia, welcome to the podcast.
Hello, Anthony.
So I have to say, big announcement. I have been working on a new big history of Byzantium for many, many years. Actually, for how many years? For exactly as long as it took to build Hagia Sophia.
Well, it's going to be a shrine.
And I finished the first draft of it this morning. So I have to say, your name came up, like I kept coming across it in the bibliography from pretty much the beginning to the end of the process. And there were very few people about whom I can say that.
Well,
So, yes.
I hope it was for some good reason.
Well, yes, because you have considerable range. I mean, today we'll be talking about a topic that's in like early Byzantine history, but in the past few weeks, you've been coming up in the bibliography on Bessarion and people like that. And so congratulations. There are not many people who have that kind of range. So anyway, and it's generally a pleasure to meet you. I've been citing you since the 90s, from the Pselos edition, before Reinsch, produced his own. That was a sort of standard one that we don't. Anyway, okay. So we're going to talk about a very, very interesting person of the late 4th, early 5th century. And just so that the audience can follow us, her name is pronounced in so many different ways that they made a joke about it in the TV show, The Good Place. I don't know if you ever saw that.
I don't think so.
Okay, so but at the end, she actually appears, and none of them can get her name right. And so she just said, just call me Patty. Yes. In Greek, I would call her Hypatia. In the American English I'm used to, she's more often called Hypatia. Yeah. How do you pronounce her name, just so that people can know that you're referring to her when you do?
I was just about to ask you.
No, okay, so use what is more comfortable for you.
Not always the same way. Yes, I'll try to use the same way because, I'm used to pronounce it Hypatia, but it sounds strange, but perhaps we'll stick to that.
Yes, that's what I hear in English most of the time, yeah.
Okay, good.
Cool. All right, so why don't we start out why don't you tell us who Hypatia was and why she's so important that so many books are written about her?
Well, an engaging question, but there is a short way to answer, at least. She was a 5th century philosopher. She was a Platonic one. She was a professor in Alexandria of Egypt. And in order to make clearer who she was, in part at least, in the briefest possible way, let me quote the words of contemporary sources, both Christian and pagan. I won't be long, because they are our key witnesses. It's important to draw from them. So the first one, a Christian, Socrates Scholasticus, the author of a church history, says that Hypatia had inherited the legacy of the teaching of the Platonic school derived from Plotinus, and she expounded to a free audience all the philosophical disciplines. And from all parts, they came to hear her, those who wanted to study philosophy. And I am ending the quote. So she was the daughter of a renowned scholar, Theon, himself a professor in the Museum of Alexandria. And from a young age, she was accustomed to studying, so to be her father's successor. According to the second main contemporary source, the pagan Damascus, which is handed over by an 11th century Byzantine encyclopedia named after its author, Suidas, she turned out yet to be by nature more gifted than her father, who was quite gifted anyway, so that she did not stop at the technical mathematical teachings he practiced, but dedicated herself to pure philosophy. What is pure philosophy? We'll perhaps see later. Third and last contemporary source, sorry, I don't want to be pedantic, but we have to stick to them without indulging in those fantasies that so many literates did over the centuries. So in the words of a third source the church history of Philosophers, who may have attended her lessons personally, Hypatia outshone her master, her father master, particularly in astronomy. And it came to pass that she was the teacher for many in mathematical sciences. So if you want to know in a nutshell who Hypatia was, she was a philosopher, a mathematician, an astronomer, and a professor, a very good one. And this is who Hypatia was for her contemporaries, both her fellow citizens and those who came to Alexandria expressly to join her circle, like her best-known pupil, Cynesius. And by the way, thanks to Cynesius's witness, which is kept in his letters, probably the most valuable information on her teaching, we may understand that she was more than a university professor, at least much more than a university professor as we understand our job now. We must not make that mistake,
Sure.
So she provided other teachings, more mysterious. We'll see about them if you wish. Even more importantly, she had a prominent political role, a role of advisor, of influencer of the ruling class of Alexandria. And this in an age of social conflict, of ethnical and of religious struggle, in an age, in Dodd's words, in an age of anxiety, of collective anxiety. So it was not only for her scholarly excellence that she was renowned, and she was a revered figure both in her city and all over the Greek-speaking world of the late antique / proto-Byzantine era. In Alexandria, she was admired and venerated, according to the wording of the sources, also for her sharp political intelligence, for her intellectual tolerance, which made her impartial, we are told, and therefore for her capacity of mediation, of political. She was listened to and loved by the various groups of citizens who disputed power in the metropolis, in the polis. And we are told by contemporary sources that even the rulers sent by the imperial government of Constantinople, such as the Augustal prefect Orestes, asked her advice and were the first to go and listen to her at her home. But if you ask me why so many books have been written about her, that is, what really made her so famous along the centuries and up to now, well, it is neither her philosophical and astronomical training, nor her political skills, nor her being a guru, let's say. It was her murder, a horrible murder. She was stripped and disfigured with potsherds. Her eyes were put out. The remains of her body were scattered through the city and then burned. And it was a scandalous murder. All this was done by Christians, fanatical Christians, allegedly monks, at the direct orders of a fanatical bishop, a bishop who is still honored as a saint by the Christian churches.
I love the fact that you started by emphasizing her life, and what she did and what she was good at and what she was known for during her lifetime, because her death has kind of overshadowed her life. And I think that's unfair to her, for all that her death was. I mean, today we might call it something like an international incident. I mean, it sent waves throughout the Eastern Mediterranean. But I think it is important to stress who she was, the person that she made herself into, and not what others did to her, which creates a very different kind of narrative. And I think Hypatia would have been important, even if she had not died in that way. Female philosophers in antiquity, and especially in late antiquity, are just a very interesting group of people altogether. And this was, I think, known at the time. In her case, her murder transposed her from sort of history into legend to a certain degree. And we'll talk a little bit about that. But can you say a little bit more about what was going on in Alexandria at that time? Just elaborate a little bit on the tensions that were tearing apart the population of the city, such that she ended up, caught almost in the crossfires and killed in this brutal way.
Yes, of course. You spoke of the waves of an international incident, and yes, I don't know if it was an incident, but it was a mistake, certainly, her murder. And in any case, we would still have Synesius's epistolary, so we certainly would know today not only her name, but her excellence, certainly, we would. In any case, yes, Alexandria. Historians are used to think of 5th century in terms of a time of bipolar struggle between pagans and Christians. Soon after the Theodosian decrees, which made Christianity the state religion and forbade the performing of Hellenic cults. But things are a bit more complicated than that. And in fact, what was going on in Alexandria was more a civil war than a religious war, in my view. And in any case, it was a three-handed power game. It was a triangle in between or among the ancient pagan elite, close to the representation of the imperial government. So the Christian officials who came from the government, the other Christians, let's say the new middle class of Christians who wanted to replace this representation of the imperial government, and the influential, the deeply rooted community of the Jews. So we can say that what Hypatia did was trying to defend, in her capacity of advisor, of influencer, of was trying to defend each religious group from its own integralist fringes, in a way. In other words, I think we have to consider the transversality to the various groups of the categories of moderation integralism. Hypatia's teaching must have been directed at helping the governing class to intellectually and pragmatically metabolize the passing from one religion to another in the name of a higher Platonic universal belief. This was typically Platonic. So she was in a way the great mistress of a sort of masonry, of proto-masonry, in which the Alexandrian elite, the pagan, the Christian, and the Jewish, but the moderate wings of them, gathered in order to face the change and also to safeguard their interests in the passage from one hegemony of cult and thought to another, and in the alternation of the dominant groups at the imperial court of Constantinople. So, it was a complicated game, but it was triggered by the clearly integralist, let's say, attitude of the bishops' first acts of Cyril of Alexandria's episcopacy since the very beginning.
So when you say integral, you mean like what we would call extremist?
Yes.
Okay. Yes. Okay. Right. So it's a different terminology. So do I understand you correctly? So when you're talking about Hypatia's position, that she's drawing on this kind of Platonic idea that religions aren't like true or false, but they just differ in the degree to which they can access the truth. And, some see a bit more, some see a bit less, or some see it here, some see it there. But a Platonic standpoint kind of, is sort of a big umbrella. Like it can encompass all of these different perspectives. So drawing on that perspective, it's not like she has a strong position. This is the truth and everything else is wrong. But it's like she can see where everybody is located on the map of religious truth. And so can mediate between them. Is that kind of what you're referring to?
Yes, and also in a way, if you, for instance, if you take Synesius, her pupil, and who would become the bishop of Ptolemais, so a Christian bishop, and he was born Christian, most probably. Well, if you read his letters, he doesn't believe a word of the Christian dogmas. He doesn't believe in the resurrection itself, which
that's pretty crucial.
Pretty crucial point, of this religion, and he writes it down. He compares these dogmas to the pagan legends of the gods. It's something for the simple people who need beliefs, legends,
right.
And while the idea, the monotheistic idea, the very idea of monotheism is, after all, a Platonic / Plotinian idea. So I don't think personally that any Platonic teacher would think to have the truth in a fideistic way, as if it was a pistis. There was no pistis. There was no hope in philosophy. There has never been. But the Weltanschauung was that of a single God, and under this Weltanschauung, the three different monotheistic cults could live side by side. I think this was what Hypatia taught, and this was the reason why she was so precious, because she helped this transition. You must understand, after the Theodosian decrees, if you wanted to have a state position, so to preserve your family tradition, your money, your wealth and power and influence, you had to be baptized. But many of these persons probably didn't want to lie, didn't want to be doing something they didn't believe in, and probably the teaching of the pious lie that Hypatia was able to provide. If you see what this is really the importance of Synesius, you see what the attitude of Synesius was, but not only his. I mean, in this time, this early age of the state religion, the transformation of Christianity into state religion, there was, in any case, a syncretistic attitude, which we can even see in iconography.
You mentioned earlier, you were pretty clear that she was murdered on the orders of Bishop Cyril of Alexandria. Mm-hmm. We know the people who did it, and these were like these para-ecclesiastical organizations that were something, but they were lay Christians who sort of dedicated part of their work to the church, or whatever the bishop told them, or something like that. Now, in a lot of scholarship, this is softened. Like, I don't think many historians put it the way you do. You're more likely to find statements like, well, things got out of hand and tempers flared and she just got caught in the middle, and it was nothing quite so strong as, Cyril was behind it. Though I think a lot of people at the time did believe that Cyril was behind it. And the government in Constantinople actually ordered an investigation into what had happened. So why do you put it so strongly that the responsibility for this lies with Cyril rather than some sort of nebulously defined climate of violence and anxiety, as you put it?
Because we know history. History is magistra vitae, we say magistra vitae, but no, this is out of the sources. There is one reason why this was downplayed by the sources. And the reason is that Cyril was a very important figure in the history of church, in the history of the dogmatics, of the Christian dogmatics themselves, with his doctrine, the Mia Physitic doctrine, etc. But there is a very clear difference between the Catholic sources and the Byzantine sources. If one reads the Byzantine sources, and not only the contemporary one, such as Socrates or Malalas slightly later, or John of Nicaea, but if you read the Byzantine sources till the 14th century, the very news Cyril was responsible for Hypatia's killing is totally clear. And so there was a cover-up. There was a cover-up at those times. Cyril got away with Hypatia's murder. There was a case of corruption. Konstantin Zuckerman has even found the name, probably, of the corrupted functionary. Oh. But there was a major cover-up in historiography, in Catholic historiography, in Western historiography. But the evidence of Cyril culpability, I think, in a nutshell, is given by three sentences of three different historians. Socrates, first of all, who says, I am quoting, "No little infamy this carried out by Cyril, since assassinations are things wholly extraneous to the spirit of Christ," which we cannot deny. More importantly, Malalas, who probably, it's a 6th century very important chronographer, let's say, historian, because he gathers more ancient sources, and sometimes he gives us the relics of a tradition which is lost. Malalas says explicitly, having received license from their bishop, the Parabolani attacked and burned Hypatia, the famous philosopher, on a pyre of fagots. And then the real, I think, clue is that provided by John of Nicaea. John of Nicaea is with Cyril. He's a Coptic historian, so he is a follower of Cyril's doctrines and politics. And that's why he reveals what probably the Egyptian milieu, the Coptic church, knew for sure. While he says, I'm quoting, "The entire people surrounded Cyril and triumphantly acclaimed him the new Theophilus." Theophilus was his uncle, the one responsible for the destruction of the Serapeum and of the statue of Serapis, because he had rid the city of the last drag of idolatry. So he, not someone else.
Right.
Of course, there are many other, but this, in a nutshell, is the reason why I don't think is any longer useful to indulge to mystification. And the church has has apologized for so many crimes, for the Fourth Crusade, for the witches burned, for possible sin, and perhaps this is one still waiting, to be
Yeah, I think that it cost Cyril because he was such a major theologian. In fact, probably the most important theologian before the split, Chalcedonians and anti-Chalcedonians, both of whom claimed him. So all subsequent theology is sort of Cyrillian and explicitly so. Yes. Nevertheless, there was no saint's life written about Cyril. There was one in the 12th century, which I think Zonaras wrote because he found that, there's no life of Cyril, so I should write something, and it's very generic. And he also wasn't represented in churches, hardly at all. There are a tiny number of exceptions, but I think this cost him. In other words, his presence in the kind of Byzantine hagiographic imagination is very limited compared to other church fathers who are mentioned much more often. Yes. But anyway, so you subtitled the book "The True Story." What other kinds of stories circulate about Hypatia? I mean, tell us a few. Your book mentions a lot, but what are some of the more interesting ones that you thought you needed to push back against?
Well, first of all, this subtitle is intentionally provocative. It relates to the contemporary historiographical notion of false or fake history. According to this, history is always false for two reasons. First, as stated by an Italian philosopher whom I like to cite, Benedetto Croce, all history is contemporary history. Yes. Which means that every era in explaining the past twists it to serve its own interests, reading it in the light of its own political dialectic. And this is the first reason. Second, history is most often written by the winners. And a scholar has to apply to any narration handed down through the centuries the old jolly critical method. He has to unveil what has been called the blank space of propaganda, which is the space that separates us from the past, from any past. Truth can be reached, of course, yet only by understanding falseness. This is let's say, the point. So this happens through a process of cross-interrogation of the witnesses, in our case, the ancient sources, which in my book proceeds by arguments. So I try to classify the versions and variations, which are, of course, more nuanced and more numerous than the ones I have now cited. But yet, on the other hand, it is also true that mystification, religious, political, historical, literary, has been the restless mill wheel that has kept Hypatia alive. I think that this is, false history has to be embraced and in a way understood and admired, not only in order to unveil the truth, but also in order to understand really what a historical figure is in its entirety. Because Hypatia is not only the woman who taught, studied, and was murdered in the 5th century. Hypatia is also all those masks, all those ideas that she has created along the centuries. So even exhilarating confusion in which each period and each ideology has transfigured that homicide and that woman, producing time after time Hypatia disguised according to the period's concerns, transform into the symbol of an idea or even just into the banner of a current political movement. Well, this is really very interesting. So yes, the true story is, first of all, understanding all the falseness and taking account of them and enjoying them. And then we need to ascertain the truth. So it's not only a matter of censorship no, we have this fantastic metamorphosis of Hypatia into a free thinker. John Toland was one of the first fans of a figure. And then we have the Enlightenment, we have the Illuminists, we have Diderot, we have Voltaire, and then we had the Romantic, and then the decadent idea of the last pagan, of this decadence, which was not a decadence as we know, because this was the cradle of the Byzantine Platonism, the one which was rocking in Alexandria while Hypatia was still alive, and even after her. So everything I have just mentioned, a few things in my book, I hope to have drawn an accurate and meticulous account of all the distortions, masks, disguisement that Hypatia received. But I think that all of them add a little bit to the importance, to the relevance, to the history, to our history, and to the history of the ancient world that she represents.
Yes, so you show in the book how each age has the Hypatia that it wants. And, as you mentioned, some have wanted to see her as a free thinker, which no one would call a free thinker, anyone in the, mainstream Platonic tradition of that time. You were in that tradition. That's what you did. Or as a kind of advocate of science against the church, as if the church was interested in science at that time, particularly. It wasn't. And all of these other transformations, as you put it. There's one I want to ask you about in particular, and perhaps because our age might be interested in a different Hypatia, which is Hypatia the feminist, or feminist icon, right? And you say that she wasn't a proto-feminist, but let me try to make the case, and you tell me where this might be going wrong. So Hypatia was a woman who was claiming pretty self-confidently a position of intellectual authority. Intellectual authority in the ancient world is masculine coded, right? It's something that men do. It's a masculine attribute. She was also claiming social leadership, right, and political influence. And again, these are things that men do in a society that she knew women were not expected to do that, where it was generally frowned upon when women did that. And nevertheless, she did it without apologizing to anybody. Now, for sure, there's no way to link her to any kind of feminist idea, right? It's not like she's calling for some kind of social transformation or anything like that. But doesn't the way she lived her life and the choices that she made, reflect a certain a critical distancing from the gender order of late Roman society?
Well, let me contradict you. Let me challenge what you say. In a way, because of course Hypatia is an example, a bright example of a great woman, etc. But I don't think anyone would mention Cleopatra as a feminist icon, for instance, or I don't know, or has anyone. In any case, she wasn't claiming that position or that leadership. She had it. She held it strongly, fiercely. And yet, the female power that her character impersonated was not the kind of power or of emancipation women have reached or have ever aimed to reach along the history of feminism, and have reached today after a struggle which was eventually won, I should say, in the 20th century. But Hypatia's power had to do with a slightly, though inspiring, different sphere. It was the priestly sphere. It was the conservation of an esoteric, a secret philosophical tradition, which made her one of the members of the lineage, let's say, of female philosophers who are constantly present in antiquity. Apollonius, the Stoic, according to Photius's Bibliotheca, wrote a comprehensive treatise about the women who philosophized. Authors of Athens also wrote about the Pythagoreans, and Diogenes Laertius, the biographer of the male, let's say, philosophers, included women, many women. But what's more interesting is that thanks to Hypatia, during the Querelle des Anciennes et des Modernes in the 17th century, Menagius, Gilles Ménage, discovered the existence of 65 female philosophers and wrote Historia Mulierum Philosopharum, and I can go on because he was not the only one, but I mean that in antiquity and late antiquity, there was a succession of women who had become perhaps they were often gifted with psychic faculties, according to the sources, but they had become the depository of that oral tradition of the secrets of Platonism that are the same ones that Synesius mentions in his Dion and in his letters referring to Hypatia, and sometimes referring to the relationship between Socrates and Aspasia, maybe with a nuance of autobiographical, let's say, memory of Hypatia. So this superiority of the female in the super-rational sphere is a heritage of the late antique spirituality and of both Pythagorean and Platonic, which is also received by the Kabbalah and through the Middle Ages. There is a Byzantine model of the female philosopher, which is both Pythagorean and Platonic, and in Psellus, you mentioned him before, the Egyptian, is always Hypatia, and is always associated with Theano, the greatest Pythagorean leader. So I think that since sometimes there is a naive rationalism in the modern catalogers of these eminent women, but there was an esoteric wisdom associated as the reverse of the coin to a strictly technically exoteric competence, always. Right. Biographies, and it seems that Hypatia is one of these cases. So undoubtedly a mathematician on one hand, but on the other hand, more obscure, but no less credible sacerdotal figure, which accounts also not only for her gender, but for her political role and for the condition of last illustrious heir to an intellectual dynasty, that of Theon, which was, in touch with this. So, in a nutshell, of course, Hypatia is a great example, a great woman, a great female figure, but she's not. I don't think she's something new that has.
Oh right, yes.
She's part of a tradition, and we should learn about this tradition because this is part of the oral heritage of our gender, which is a gender that less often wrote its knowledges, its wisdom, but very often had the torch passed in this, let's say, secret way.
I mean, it doesn't have to be secret in necessarily in a mysterious way, but it's a tradition that isn't often just recorded in explicit texts, with one possible exception. And this is something I looked into sort of a while ago. I think that a prominent part of this tradition is the Pythagorean Platonic, as you mentioned. I mean, Socrates in the Republic makes explicit arguments for the intellectual equality of women. And I don't think it's an accident that it's the Platonic tradition that contains most of these prominent female philosophers in Antiquity. And I think also even into Byzantium. If you look at the preface of Anna Komnena's history, she mentions the Pythagoreans and the Platonists as people she studied. Yeah, of course. I know why you're saying that. That's great. Anyway, there is much more to say about this tradition.
Of course, it's endless. I mean, during the Byzantine millennium, we have this half subterranean stream of Platonic, quote, pagan, but as we have said, Platonism is not confessional, so they were also pagan, but also Christians, and is half hidden and half evident. But we had prominent women up to the Paleologian times that were certainly initiated, and then this was passed over to the Renaissance, which is only the last of the Byzantine Renaissances, and this ended up to Ficini's Academy, and then women were excluded when these tradition got back to the West, but not.
Oh, right. There's a lot more that we can talk about regarding Hypatia, but we're almost out of time. And I wanted to close with a question that has to do with her modern representation. And that is specifically the film Agora. I know you've sort of discussed it in the past. If the audience doesn't know it, I strongly recommend that they watch it. I mean, it's however you react to it, it's definitely worth watching.
Yeah, it's very simple. I think I liked that film very much because Alejandro Amenabar followed one of the main, and I would say more alluring trends in his interpretation of Hypatia, the version given by the Illuminists, that of Diderot and Voltaire and even Montesquieu in a way. So using her as an example of the, and I quote Diderot and Voltaire, excesses of fanaticism, les excès du fanatisme, he made his film about old and new religious and or political fundamentalism. There is a clear transference between the ancient Parabalani, that is Cyril's militia, and contemporary Talibani, or better, those militants of the self-appointed new Islamic Caliphate, whose violences struck the first decade of our century, when the movie was shot. You may have noticed in the original soundtrack that the Christian Parabalani speak with a marked Arab accent. Amenabar's aim was to show that fundamentalism and violence do not belong necessarily to one religion, but they mark, and this is the idea of Voltaire, of Diderot, and Montesquieu, religion itself once it reaches to temporal power. So Islam today, like the beginning of the political power of Christian church, as soon as it became a state religion at the very time of Hypatia's murder, so shortly after the Theodosian decrees, were in a way paralleled in Amenabar movie. So Amenabar, as the Illuminists, does not blame religion itself, but precisely the merging, the overlapping of priestly sphere, which is what Socrates Scholasticus reproaches to Cyril, that of avidly eroding the state power in a way that was never previously allowed to the priestly sphere. That was the problem with Cyril. And Amenabar does not blame religion itself, but the overlapping of temporal power and the priestly sphere. And I think that Socrates Scholasticus, from his point of view, which was the one of Constantinople, so the one of a state which for a millennium kept separate the two powers, I think that Socrates was the first historian to blame this feature. He blamed it in Cyril's policy, but I think this is a feature which is the definition of religious fundamentalism itself. So I think the movie by Amenabar gives us not only Hypatia, but a very important slice of the meaning that Hypatia had in our culture, as well as a further proof of the very fact that all history is contemporary history.
Yes. Yeah, I thought it was a beautifully made movie. I understood what it was trying to say about that. I was much more troubled about the kind of racialization of these differences. That is, I didn't like the fact that the good Christians are blonde and blue-eyed and the bad Christians all look like, Arabs. I mean, that bothered me. I don't like it when Christianity tries to externalize its own luggage and kind of, throw it off onto other people. Even during that decade when supposedly we were concerned about terrorists, I have never been more concerned about, terrorists from outside the US living in this country than from the people in it. And the people in it who, are armed and fanatical and dangerous. And now we're seeing, those things were all here. Those things were all here in that decade.
Yes, but if I may add, maybe we are out of time.
No.
Of course, it's very sensible what you say, but this movie was a pamphlet, let's say. It was a pamphlet about the fundamentalist nature of the beginning of any new religion, in a way.
Sure.
So, in my view. But just an anecdote, a brief one. Pope Ratzinger, back 16th, during his papacy, he celebrated Cyril of Alexandria, praising, in public occasion, praising the energy, and I quote, of his ecclesiastic governance.
Oh boy.
So I was, while reading these, I was a bit struck. And as soon as I found someone who was acquainted, these years later, a few years ago, 3 years ago, personally acquainted with the Pope, the ex-Pope now, a mathematician, a prominent Italian mathematician who's my friend and is very close to Ratzinger, I asked him to ask Ratzinger why he uttered such words and why he did not mention Hypatia, or in any case, why. Mm-hmm. And I have two letters written by Ratzinger, the PDF of two letters written by Ratzinger to this friend of mine, the mathematician. In the first, he says that he didn't know about Hypatia.
What?
Yes, he did not. And he was very sorry about her, and all his prayers would be, for her. And the second letter, in which he said, but it's unavoidable. When a new religion comes out, fundamentalism is unavoidable. These are the very words of the ex-Pope.
Sure.
So, it's, you see, they merge.
Yeah.
The Amenabar, and with his tradition from the 18th century, and the realpolitiker, let's say, the insider of Roman papacy, the ex-Pope, they say the same thing. At the very beginning of a religion, fundamentalism is unavoidable. But we have Hypatia, and we can, follow her example and try to fight.
And terrorists can also be wearing suits and have political positions. They don't necessarily have to be the cinematic version that we know.
Yes, of course.
But I take comfort that a woman like her existed and did what she did. And she did it for a very long time. We should also mention that she was fairly old by the time that she was killed. I mean, that.
I think she was about 45.
Oh, 45. I thought maybe a bit older.
Because there are discussions about the date, but because Malalas, says he was Palia, but a woman was Palia at 45 those times. But in any case, yes, she did a lot, and in any case, we are grateful for what she did, and if she was not a real feminist, she's certainly a great example for everyone, not only our gender, but particularly for women.
That's a great note to end on. So thank you very much, Silvia, for coming on. I really appreciate your insight on this fascinating character, Hypatia.
Thank you so much. Thank you for hearing me and for your patience.
No, my pleasure. And I hope we manage to meet in person at some point.
Of course, we'll see. I mean, you mentioned you might not be able to come to Venice, and I understand because it's August and very hot. But
that's not the reason. We start classes that week.
Oh, really?
Yes, it's the first week of classes. It makes it very difficult to go to the International Congress.
I understand. Well, in any case, there will certainly be another occasion. And in any case, let's keep in touch. It was great meeting you at last and talking and chatting, and I would go on forever.
Take care, Silvia.
Afternoon, and bye-bye.